Hey folks, and welcome to our reading wrap-up for November 2024. Let's get right into it and keep the video as short as we can. Just so everybody knows, if I seem a little cranky today, this is my fourth day without tobacco, which is a big deal. So go me, and I will attempt to not chew anyone's face off. I finished 3 books since the last update that was vaguely like this on this channel. The first of those was Rhythm of War, which I finished around mid-November. This is by Brandon Sanderson. It is book 4 in the Stormlight Archive. It was outstanding. I did not feel like the ending landed quite as powerfully as the endings of the previous 3 Stormlight Archive books. But I think in terms of overall pacing, it probably comes out a little bit ahead of Oathbringer. It is going to be my least favorite of the 4 Stormlight Archive books so far, but a couple of caveats on that. One is that they're all still 5-star books, so there's not like an enormous gap between the best of the books, or my favorite that I've read so far, which would be Oathbringer, and Rhythm of War. And secondly, on a reread, my opinion might change absolutely completely. At the moment, I have a really high opinion of The Way of Kings, for example, and I might like Rhythm of War better than The Way of Kings were I to do a reread, which I do plan to do. But I'm not going to do it until we have Stormlight 6 on the horizon. More about the Stormlight Archive in a moment. In the meantime, Rhythm of War is an absolute banger. It gets a high recommendation from me and 5 out of 5 stars. Next up, we finished Reaper's Gale. This is by Stephen Erickson and is the 7th book in his 10-book Maltese Book of the Fallen. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that I'm super into this series, and Reaper's Gale did not disappoint in any way. It did go through it relatively slowly. It took me about 2.5 weeks to read it. It is a fairly large book. These books tend to get bigger as the series goes on, but it was nevertheless outstanding. There is I think some really interesting events that happen in Reaper's Gale, both in terms of the novel itself's kind of self-contained narrative, and in terms of the greater story that we appear to be moving towards in the Maltese Book of the Fallen. This book also gets a 5 out of 5 stars and a very, very high recommendation from me. I did a short about this too, but I decided to DNF Empire of Silence by Christopher Rocchio. Now, this is an incredibly well-loved series that gets highly recommended all over BookTok, BookSky, BookTube, all over the place. Tons of people like this series, and I do not presume to tell those folks that they are wrong, but it didn't work for me, and here's why. So the first book in the Sun Eater series, and really kind of the second book too, are basically prologues to the main story that gets set up in the first page or so of Empire of Silence, and that initial hook is really strong. The problem I had is that the book is told in first person by the main character, the Sun Eater himself, Hadrian Marlowe. My problem is that Hadrian is really boring throughout huge chunks of this book. There are narrative reasons for that, but that does not necessarily make it easier to read. And the idea that I was going to have to put up with another 6 or 8 or whatever it is, 100 pages, before we get to the main action of the book, where the central character is just not connecting with me, made me DNF this book. That's why I DNF'd it. Again, it's supposed to be good, and I would regard this as a soft DNF. I did, after all, buy the thing, so there is a chance I'm going to get back to it, but at this point, that's probably not going to happen until at least 2026. Yesterday, I finished The Sunlit Man by Brandon Sanderson. This was good. It was not, however, as good as any of the big Stormlight Archive books, probably approximately as good as Edge Dancer and Dawn Shard, although I think this sort of central idea or motivating activity behind this book, I think, is pretty cool. It definitely gave me a vibe of early Edgar Rice Burroughs, think John Carter of Mars, or maybe At the Earth's Core, maybe even a little bit of Tarzan in terms of the kind of technology that we see in this book, and in terms of the kind of exploration within the plot that we see in this book. I definitely got sort of an old school science fantasy vibe that I thought was really cool and which helped carry me through the book. Again, it's not as good a book as the big Stormlight Archive books, but maybe we shouldn't expect it to be. That might be unreasonable. I give this a 4.4 out of 5 stars. Serious Brandon Sanderson fans should, of course, absolutely read this. I would recommend, if you're not a serious Brandon Sanderson fan, that you wait until at least reading the first 4 Stormlight Archive books before reading The Sunlit Man, because that will kind of help you contextualize a little bit more of what's going on. As I mentioned in the short, this is a very heavy Cosmere lore book. And I liked that. I felt like I was discovering new things about the Cosmere, which I think we're gonna 30 years from now feel is really a science fantasy series based on some of the elements that I have heard about in books that I haven't read, and some of the elements that I actually got to see in The Sunlit Man. So again, recommended, but read it at the right time. Now on to what I'm currently reading, starting with Last Argument of Kings by Joe Abercrombie. This is the first book in his original First Law series. I am listening to this via the audiobook narrated by Stephen Pacey, who is absolutely magical reading these books. It is an amazing experience, and I cannot recommend the audiobook experience for at least these particular books highly enough. I'm about 30% of the way into the book right now because I'm listening via audiobook, and I don't spend 20 hours a week listening to audiobooks. My progress is going to be kind of slow, but I do continue moving forward on this. And a whole lot's happened so far. More has happened so far in this book than happened in the entire second book in the series. Abercrombie seems to be becoming better at plot, which is not a strong point of the first 2 books in the series. It is better here. And of course, the characters and dialogue remain amazing in this 3rd volume. And all of the characters that we've come to love or despise or pity do make an appearance here in Last Argument of Kings. I'm still reading The Last Dangerous Visions, edited on paper by Harlan Ellison and, in fact, by J. Michael Straczynski. This is a collection of short stories and a follow-up, a long-awaited follow-up to Ellison's 2 anthologies from, I think, the early 70s, Dangerous Visions and again Dangerous Visions, which were landmark anthologies. And I think we have to credit them for that. But I don't know that I think the individual stories in those anthologies, which I have read, were all that great. And so far, The Last Dangerous Visions is kind of keeping pace with that. Some of the stories are good. Some of the stories are but they're short stories, so they're relatively easy to get through. That said, I haven't made a ton of progress on this book since I've been intensely reading other things, but I do expect to make some progress this week. More on that in a second. As you're probably aware, Wind and Truth, Book 5 in the Stormlight Archive, comes out on December 6th. That is this Friday, and it's Monday as I'm recording this. So I'm really reluctant to start the next Malazan book, Told the Hounds, which is a huge, big book. I know I'm going to get to Wind and Truth more or less immediately on Friday. I've even read ahead on the preview chapters that are available at reactormag.com, and I really like Wind and Truth so far. So I had to make a decision whether I wanted to start Told the Hounds now and probably have to put it aside in 4 days, or whether I wanted to try and read something lighter. So what I've landed on is, first of all, I will try to read some more of the short stories in The Last Dangerous Visions. But I also started The Maltese Falcon by Dashiell Hammett. This is the classic hard-boiled detective story. It starts exactly as you would expect a hard-boiled detective story to start. I picked this particular book for a couple of reasons. One, I would like to try to read some things outside of my normal habitats, science fiction, fantasy, history, and stuff like that. And I did love the movie. This is the 1941 adaptation of this book with, of course, Peter Lorre and Humphrey Bogart. That's an amazing film. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend that. So I'm starting to read the book. It's like 150 pages, so it should be a pretty quick read. I should be able to get it done this week, even if I stack a few of the short stories from The Last Dangerous Visions on top of it. Now that leaves us with the next books that are going to enter the currently reading list. And those books are Told the Hounds, Book 8 in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, which I'm having just a tremendous time with this series so far. And this is Book 8. I read, as you'll recall, the first 4 books like 20 years ago. I restarted the whole series from the beginning in August, and I have had a fantastic time with this series so far. And then, of course, there's Wind and Truth, which is also a very large book. It is also part of the Stormlight Archive, a series that I am, again, tremendously enjoying for more or less completely different reasons than Malazan. It's certainly not as grim, although it does go to some pretty dark places that I think are worth exploring with Sanderson as he continues to tell the story about these characters. Now, I did an extended, it's not that extended, it's like 7.5 minutes long, TBR video like a week ago. So check that video out if you want to see like everything that's on the TBR and could potentially get slotted in here. I don't have like a strict order in which the books hit the currently reading list. I do rather kind of have a pool of books, and then I will pull, when I finish one book, I will pull a book from the TBR pool, more or less what I feel like reading at that particular time. And this method seems to work well for me. You do what works for you. But that's our November reading update. Let me know what you're reading in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel.